Let's go to these threats at home, and I want to bring in a Liberal MP and former Army officer Keith Wolahan live from Melbourne. Thanks for joining us, Keith. I want to ask you first up, given the arrests and incidents we've seen over the past 3 weeks, does Australia face an Islamist extremist terrorism threat?
Chris, thank you for having me. You quite rightly brought up the knowledge and awareness of the threat back in 2001 and then the Bali bombing. The difference between now and then is that most people have a little device in their hands that is like that scene in Clockwork Orange, where people are continuously watching horrible images of gore and violence, and they're having a narrative in their heads that has them portrayed as a hero and those they disagree with as a villain. And I think that will increase the risk of people who are disturbed or are looking to justify a violent act.
So we know that online radicalisation has been a problem for a long while, and we know that social media has had all sorts of impacts in society. You're suggesting maybe one of the reasons we're seeing teenagers allegedly involved in these plots is the radicalisation through mobile devices?
I think it doesn't help, and all of us are human and we have human brains, and so when you open up a device and you constantly see the same images, and I've seen people who send quite inflammatory documents to me by email or in person, and often I say, well, what are these people watching? And I think if I was exposed to what they are looking at, I too might consider viewing the world in a binary way that they do. So what we need to do is we need to find a way to encourage critical thinking again, because it can't be the case that people have their own narrative that they're the hero in, and the others have an opposite view where they're the hero. They can't both be true. So we need to get back to having an encouragement of dialogue where people are exposed to different ideas and they have their parents and their peer group say, that hate that's coming out of your mouth, who do you think you are? Where do you think that ends?
Now, I know that authorities and politicians don't want to alienate Muslim communities, but we can't deal with this unless we're prepared to actually call it out and talk about it as an Islamist threat and work closely with Muslim communities to deal with it, surely. And that seems to me like where we've dropped the ball over the past decade.
Well, we can do that in a way that does two things, Chris. It acknowledges the great contribution and value of Muslim Australians, many of whom serve in uniform. We have many serving as candidates in the upcoming federal election for the Liberal Party, as do the other parties. I do here in my seat. I greatly value their contribution. But we can have a debate and a discussion about extremist elements within any group in society and do that in a mature way. And again, it comes back to open, frank conversations and encouraging critical thinking.
Well, has the government, from the Prime Minister down, done enough to combat the hate speech and anti-Semitism we've seen in a number of locations, in a number of environments, but particularly now at university protests?
Well, that particular example is quite disappointing. I've found Jason Clare to be one of the best communicators in the government, but for him to be lost for words as to what river to the sea means, and you quite properly defined it as from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, it is totally inconsistent with a two-state solution or even a square metre of the state of Israel. It's about its destruction. And so to split hairs on what that means is really quite disappointing. And that Minister Clare knows what words to choose, and he's choosing those words very carefully. And I'm disappointed that the Education Minister couldn't have that frank conversation about what that means.
Just briefly on one other important issue, and this is the one of the immigration detainees and this horrible duck shoving from the government that try and say that their Community Protection Board is really the one who says who should wear ankle bracelets or not. In the end, isn't the responsibility legally with the minister?
Look, we live in a constitutional democracy where power is separated, particularly between the judiciary and the executive and the legislative branch. The problem has been created by the NZYQ case, but there is now a system that is being put in place for the ministers to better handle it. And all they're giving Australians is empathy. But what Australians need and want is competence, and they're not getting it from these ministers.
Keith, thanks for joining us. I appreciate it. Keith Wolahan there, who's, of course, a Liberal MP from Victoria, also a former Army officer. Now, in